My husband demanded a divorce, clueless that I earned $450,000. He sneered, I refused to be tied to a lazy, worthless woman. Later he married my best friend, only to choke on his own arrogance when he discovered my success. The look on his face. Priceless. Thomas handed me the divorce papers with the smug expression of someone who thought he was about to leave a penniless woman with nothing. He'd calculated everything based on what he believed about my income, my worth, my ability to survive without him. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with another email from my literary agent about international publishing rights. The irony was delicious. While he'd been planning his exit strategy, I'd been building an empire he didn't even know existed. Danielle watched from the doorway, probably already planning how to spend what she thought would be his newfound freedom from financial responsibility. $1,000 a month in alimony seems fair, Thomas declared, setting his briefcase on my hospital bed like this was just another business transaction. Since you don't actually work. I glanced at my phone screen where the email notification showed a 7-figure offer for film rights to my children's book series. Don't actually work. If he only knew. But let me take you back to how we got here because this moment of pure arrogance was built on 15 years of careful deception. Not mine but his. Before we dive deeper into Rachel's journey, if you believe in the power of quiet strength and turning betrayal into triumph, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us share these empowering stories with more women who need them. I was 22 and desperately broke when Thomas first noticed me in that cramped coffee shop near Northwestern University. My art supplies were spread across a tiny corner table, and I was nursing a single latte that had to last me the entire afternoon while I worked on portfolio pieces. Student loans were crushing me and my parents kept suggesting I switch to something more practical, like business or teaching. Thomas appeared beside my table without warning, his shadow falling across my sketchbook. That's remarkable, he said, pointing to my drawing of an elderly man reading by the window. You've captured something most people would never even notice. He was handsome in that clean-cut, confident way that usually intimidated me. Pressed khakis, button-down shirt, hair perfectly styled despite the Chicago wind. The kind of man who looked like he had his entire future mapped out in 5-year plans. I'm Thomas, he said, sliding into the opposite chair without invitation. And you're incredibly talented. That was Thomas, bold, decisive, unafraid to insert himself into any situation. Within minutes he'd convinced me to show him my entire portfolio, studying each piece with genuine fascination. He asked questions about technique and inspiration that no one had ever bothered to ask before. This Fox character, he said, lingering over my sketches of what would eventually become Brave Little Fox. There's something special about him. He's got personality, real depth for a children's illustration. His enthusiasm was intoxicating. Here was someone who not only understood my art but could envision its potential in ways I'd never considered. Thomas worked in marketing for a downtown firm and had big plans, starting his own agency, traveling the world, building something meaningful. I can see you illustrating for major publishers, he continued, carefully turning pages in my sketchbook. Your style would translate beautifully to children's books. Have you thought about developing this Fox into a series? I hadn't, but suddenly I could see it. Thomas had a gift for making dreams seem achievable, for taking my quiet artistic aspirations and painting them in bold, confident strokes. Our courtship unfolded like something from a romantic movie. Thomas would pick me up in his Honda Civic and drive us to hidden hiking trails or small galleries he'd discovered online. He genuinely seemed fascinated by my creative process, often sitting quietly while I sketched landscapes or painted watercolors of our adventures. You see the world differently, he told me one evening as we sat on the shores of Lake Michigan, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades I was already planning to recreate on canvas. You notice beauty in places where other people just see ordinary life. Those words meant everything to someone who'd spent her childhood being called impractical by well-meaning relatives. Thomas made me feel like my artistic vision had value, like my perspective mattered in ways I'd never imagined. He proposed 6 months later with a simple silver band he'd bought with his tax refund. The proposal happened in that same coffee shop where we'd met, at the exact table where he'd first seen my work. I know I can't afford the ring you deserve right now, he said, dropping to one knee while other customers pretended not to stare. But I promise you, Rachel, I'm going to build a life where you never have to worry about money again. where you can focus entirely on your art without stress about bills or rent or any of that practical stuff that kills creativity. I said yes before he finished speaking. Our wedding was small but perfect. Just immediate family and close friends in his parents' backyard. His mother, Margaret, had transformed the space with string lights and mason jars filled with wildflowers from her garden. My parents, practical people who'd never understood my artistic pursuits, seemed charmed by Thomas's obvious devotion and clear plans for our future. "He really loves you," my mother whispered during our first dance to music playing from Thomas's ancient boombox. "I can see it in how he talks about your dreams like they're his own." He was right. In those early years, Thomas looked at me like I was something precious and rare. He'd surprise me with art supplies he couldn't really afford, or take me to gallery openings where he'd introduce me to strangers as my wife, the artist, with unmistakable pride in his voice. We rented a tiny apartment above a bakery downtown, and Thomas immediately converted the second bedroom into a studio for me. He painted the walls bright white, installed extra lighting fixtures, and even built custom shelves for my supplies using YouTube tutorials and borrowed tools. "Every artist needs proper workspace," he declared, standing back to admire his handiwork. "This is where you're going to create masterpieces." Every morning, I'd wake to the smell of fresh bread from below and find Thomas making coffee in our miniature kitchen, already dressed for work but never too rushed to ask about my plans for the day. "What's brave little fox up to today?" he'd ask, referring to the character I'd been developing based on his early encouragement. "He's learning to be brave enough to cross the big river," I might answer, or "he's helping a lost bunny find her way home through the dark forest." Thomas would listen intently, offering suggestions or asking questions that helped me work through plot problems. He became my first audience, my sounding board, my most enthusiastic supporter. Those early years felt magical in their simplicity. Saturday mornings meant farmers' markets, where I'd sketch vendors while Thomas charmed everyone from the honey seller to the elderly woman who made soap from goat milk. Evenings were for cooking together in our cramped kitchen, sharing cheap wine and planning imaginary vacations to places we couldn't yet afford. "Someday we'll go to Tuscany," Thomas would say, studying travel brochures spread across our kitchen table. "You can paint those rolling hills and cypress trees in person." "Someday," I'd agree, adding details to my sketch of him reading those same brochures by candlelight. What I didn't tell him was that someday was arriving faster than either of us expected. 3 months after our wedding, I sold my first professional illustration to a parenting magazine for $75. 6 months later, a small publisher expressed serious interest in developing Brave Little Fox into a picture book series. The money started modestly, $50 here, $100 there, but it was steady and growing. More importantly, it was mine. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't completely dependent on someone else's income. The feeling was both thrilling and somehow dangerous. I opened a separate business account, telling Thomas it was for tax purposes and to keep my freelance earnings organized. Really, I wasn't entirely sure why I felt compelled to keep my growing success quiet. Maybe it was because Thomas took such visible pride in being our provider, in fulfilling the promise he'd made during his proposal. Or maybe some instinct was already warning me that financial independence was something worth protecting. Whatever the reason, I downplayed my earnings and let Thomas believe his marketing salary was our primary source of security. When royalty checks arrived, I'd deposit them quietly and continue living as if we were still the struggling newlyweds sharing ramen dinners and dreaming of better days. "You don't need to stress about money anymore," Thomas would tell me whenever I expressed concern about a large purchase or unexpected expense. "That's my responsibility now. Your job is to create beautiful things and let me handle the practical stuff." And I did create beautiful things. My Brave Little Fox series found its publisher, then its audience, then its merchandising deals. Corporate clients started requesting my illustrations for advertising campaigns. International publishers began expressing interest in foreign language rights. But I also created something else during those early years, something I didn't fully understand at the time. I created a foundation of secret financial strength that would prove invaluable when everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and marriage came crashing down around me. The woman Thomas was now trying to destroy financially had actually been supporting both of our lifestyles for years, building an empire while he took credit for our comfortable life. The irony would have been funny if it weren't about to become the perfect weapon in my own hands. The shift happened on a Thursday night in October, during one of our usual dinner parties at Anthony and Danielle's house. We'd been doing these monthly gatherings for 3 years, taking turns hosting, trying new recipes, playing board games until midnight. It was our tradition, our way of staying connected as couples navigating our late 20s. Danielle had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her salmon and declining the wine she normally loved. Anthony kept shooting her encouraging glances across the table, and I noticed his hand resting protectively on her shoulder whenever he passed behind her chair. "We have something to share," Danielle announced as Anthony began clearing the dinner plates. She stood slowly, placing both hands on her still flat stomach with a gesture so deliberate it could only mean one thing. The smile that spread across her face was radiant, transforming her entire appearance. "We're having a baby." The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Thomas exploded from his chair. "Not Anthony, Thomas." My husband reached Danielle first, wrapping her in an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground and lasted far longer than any congratulatory hug should. "This is incredible," Thomas exclaimed, his voice cracking with emotion I'd never heard before. "When? How far along? Have you seen a doctor yet?" Anthony stood frozen beside the kitchen counter, dinner plates still in his hands, watching his wife being celebrated by another man. His smile looked forced, almost painful, and he kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. The rest of the evening became the Thomas and Danielle show. He peppered them with questions about due dates, nursery themes, and potential baby names. He knew more about pregnancy symptoms than I did, rattling off information about morning sickness remedies and prenatal vitamin recommendations like he'd been studying for months. "Have you thought about a birthing plan?" Thomas asked, leaning forward with intense focus. "Natural birth versus epidural? Hospital versus birthing center?" "Thomas," I interrupted gently, "maybe let them process this themselves first." He shot me a look of pure irritation. "This is important, Rachel. These decisions matter." Danielle basked in his attention, her hand never leaving her stomach as she answered his endless questions. Anthony grew quieter with each passing hour, eventually retreating to the kitchen to do dishes while Thomas discussed baby-proofing strategies and college savings plans. When we finally left that night, Thomas couldn't stop talking. The 15-minute drive home became a monologue about how wonderful it was that our group was expanding, how exciting it would be to have a little one around, how much fun family vacations would become. "Isn't this amazing, Rachel?" he said, pulling into our driveway with unusual speed. "A baby. Our first baby in the group." The possessive way he said "our" made my stomach clench. "It's their baby, Thomas. Anthony and Danielle's." "Of course," he said quickly, but something in his eyes suggested otherwise. "I just meant we'll all be part of this child's life. Like aunts and uncles." I went to bed that night with an uneasiness I couldn't name, watching Thomas research baby gear on his laptop until nearly 2 in the morning. Within weeks, Thomas had transformed into Danielle's personal pregnancy consultant. He called her daily to check on morning sickness symptoms, researched the best obstetricians in our area, and somehow knew more about her appointment schedule than Anthony did. "Dr. Martinez is supposed to be excellent," Thomas announced over breakfast one Tuesday, reading from his phone. I found 3 reviews that specifically mentioned his bedside manner with first-time mothers. "How do you know Danielle's looking for a new doctor?" I asked. "She mentioned it yesterday when I called to check on her nausea levels." The casualness with which he discussed my best friend's bodily functions was disturbing. When had they become so intimate that morning sickness was acceptable phone conversation? Thomas started carrying crackers in his car, just in case Danielle needed them during their increasingly frequent outings. He downloaded 3 different pregnancy tracking apps, setting notifications for weekly development milestones that he'd share with me over dinner like breaking news. "The baby is the size of a blueberry this week," he'd announce. "Can you imagine? Something that tiny already has a heartbeat." The final straw came when Thomas quit smoking overnight, something I'd been asking him to do for our entire relationship. "It's not healthy to be around pregnant women," he explained, tossing his half-full pack into the trash with theatrical determination. "Secondhand smoke can cause birth defects." "I've been asking you to quit for 3 years," I said quietly. "This is different, Rachel. This is about protecting an innocent child." "What about protecting your wife?" His jaw tightened. "This isn't about you right now. Some things are bigger than our personal preferences. That night, I heard him on the phone with Danielle, discussing prenatal yoga classes and organic grocery stores that carried pregnancy-safe cleaning products. His voice carried a tenderness I hadn't heard directed toward me in months. 6 months into Danielle's pregnancy, I reached my breaking point. We were having dinner at our kitchen table when Thomas casually mentioned signing up to volunteer coach for a youth soccer league. I figured I should get some practice, he said, cutting his steak with unusual precision. You know, for when the baby gets older. I set down my fork with deliberate control. Thomas, are you planning to be this child's father? His face flushed deep red and his hands stilled on his knife. What kind of question is that? A legitimate one. You know more about Danielle's pregnancy than her own husband does. You've changed your entire lifestyle around her needs. You're making long-term plans that involve raising someone else's child. How can you be so heartless? He exploded, standing abruptly from the table. Danielle needs support right now. Anthony works 60-hour weeks and barely has time to take her to appointments. You've never wanted children. You couldn't possibly understand what she's going through. And you do understand? Since when did you become an expert on maternal needs? The argument escalated quickly from there. Thomas accused me of jealousy, selfishness, and failing to support our friends during an important time. I accused him of emotional infidelity and abandoning his marriage for the fantasy of someone else's family. Maybe if you showed half the interest in other people's lives that you show in your art career, he snapped, you'd understand what real friendship looks like. We slept in separate bedrooms that night, the first time in our marriage. Thomas apologized the next morning, bringing me coffee in bed and promising to be more mindful of boundaries. But his behavior didn't change. If anything, he became more secretive about his time with Danielle, claiming he was protecting her from unnecessary stress by not mentioning their conversations to me. When Harper was born on a rainy Tuesday in May, Thomas was the second person to hold her. Not me, not Danielle's mother, not any of her other friends, Thomas. I stood in the hospital doorway watching my husband cradle my best friend's newborn daughter with tears streaming down his face. She's absolutely perfect, he whispered, and Danielle beamed at him with an intimacy that made my chest ache. Anthony sat in the corner chair looking exhausted and overwhelmed, like a man who'd just witnessed a miracle but couldn't quite process the implications. Thomas, meanwhile, looked complete, like he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment, this child, this purpose. The weeks following Harper's birth became a blur of Thomas's daily hospital visits, arriving with flowers, baby clothes, and an enthusiasm that bordered on manic. He knew Harper's feeding schedule, her sleep patterns, her preferred burping techniques. I realized with growing horror that my husband was more invested in this child's well-being than I was in my own career milestones. She smiled at me today, Thomas would report over dinner. Real smiles, not just gas. The nurses said it's early for social smiling, but Harper's clearly advanced. As Thomas became more entrenched in his role as Harper's surrogate father, Anthony began disappearing from our friend group entirely. He'd make excuses to skip dinners, arrive late to gatherings, and leave early with vague mentions of work deadlines. When I tried to connect with him, he'd change the subject or claim overwhelming stress was making him poor company. I found myself increasingly isolated, watching my marriage dissolve while my career ironically flourished. Publishers were calling with new opportunities, international rights deals were materializing, and my bank account grew steadily. But professional success felt meaningless when my personal life was crumbling around me. Late at night, while Thomas was at Danielle's house helping with bedtime routines and night feedings, I'd work on illustrations with a desperate intensity, pouring my loneliness and confusion into children's stories about brave little animals finding their way home through dark forests. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my marriage fell apart, I was creating my most successful work about courage, friendship, and finding strength in solitude. What I didn't anticipate was how completely Thomas would embrace his unofficial role as Harper's father as she grew older. By her second birthday, he was the one researching preschools and debating the merits of Montessori versus traditional education with Danielle over long phone calls that stretched well past dinner time. Harper needs structure but also creative freedom, Thomas would explain to me afterward, as if I'd asked for his educational philosophy. Danielle agrees that academic pressure this early could stunt her natural curiosity. When Harper turned 3, Thomas insisted on throwing her birthday party at our house because we had the bigger backyard. I watched from the kitchen window as he pushed her on the swing set he'd installed the weekend before. A swing set we'd never discussed, never budgeted for, that simply appeared one Saturday morning along with Thomas's announcement that Harper needs outdoor play equipment. The other parents at that party naturally assumed Thomas was Harper's father. He wore that assumption like a comfortable jacket, introducing himself as Harper's Thomas, and discussing her developmental milestones with the casual authority of someone who'd been present for every first word, first step, first scraped knee. Anthony sat alone on our back porch during that party, nursing a beer and watching his daughter call another man Daddy Thomas, while her actual father became increasingly invisible in her life. By kindergarten, Thomas attended every parent-teacher conference, knew Harper's teacher Mrs. Rodriguez's coffee preferences, and had strong opinions about her reading level and social development. He'd bring home detailed reports of these school meetings, sharing Harper's progress with me as if I were an interested family friend rather than his wife. "She's testing above grade level in reading comprehension," he announced one evening, waving Harper's report card with paternal pride. "Mrs. Rodriguez thinks she might be ready for advanced placement next year." I studied Thomas's face as he spoke, noting the way his entire expression transformed when discussing Harper. This was the look I'd hoped to see someday if we'd had children together. Pure, uncomplicated love mixed with fierce protectiveness and genuine pride. Instead, I was witnessing it directed toward another woman's child while our own marriage withered from neglect. The photos started appearing everywhere around our house. Harper's school pictures joined our wedding photos on the mantelpiece. Harper's artwork covered our refrigerator. Thomas's wallet bulged with snapshots of Harper at various ages, and his phone background cycled through her latest pictures like a devoted parent's digital shrine. Meanwhile, our conversations became perfunctory exchanges about household logistics and social obligations. Thomas would update me on Harper's activities with enthusiasm, then ask about my work with polite disinterest before returning to his phone to text Danielle about Harper's bedtime routine or weekend plans. 3 years passed this way, with Thomas becoming more embedded in Harper's daily life while I became increasingly peripheral in my own marriage. We were polite roommates sharing expenses and occasionally appearing together at social functions where Thomas would spend most of the evening discussing Harper's latest achievements with other parents. The night everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was working late in my studio, putting finishing touches on illustrations for a new publisher, when I heard the doorbell ring at nearly 11 o'clock. Thomas was at one of his client meetings, the frequency of which had increased dramatically since Harper started school. I opened the door to find Anthony standing on my porch, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and he carried a tablet clutched against his chest like evidence in a murder trial. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I stepped aside to let him in, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he set the tablet on my kitchen table. Anthony was always precise, methodical, the kind of person who debugged software problems with patient determination. Seeing him this agitated was more frightening than any shouting match would have been. "Look at this," he said quietly, opening the tablet to display a map with colored dots marking various locations throughout our city. The dots formed a pattern that made my stomach clench. 3 nights a week, consistently, Danielle's car appeared at the Riverside in downtown, a modest hotel that catered to business travelers and offered hourly rates for obvious reasons. "GPS tracking from her car," Anthony explained, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd had their worst suspicions confirmed. "Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday evening for the past 3 months. Always between 7 and 10 p.m. I stared at the evidence, my mind automatically cataloging Thomas's schedule. Client meetings with the Peterson account on Tuesdays. Thursday evening strategy sessions for the Morrison campaign. Sunday planning meetings for the upcoming week. All lies. All perfectly crafted alibis for an affair that had been happening right under my nose. "How long have you suspected?" I asked. "Honestly, since Harper was born. Maybe before." Anthony rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. "But suspecting and knowing are different things. I needed proof before I could act on it." We sat in my kitchen for hours that night, 2 betrayed spouses examining the wreckage of our marriages with the clinical detachment of investigators. Anthony showed me credit card statements, hotel receipts he'd found in Danielle's purse, photographs of Thomas's car in the hotel parking lot taken from his office building across the street. Neither of us cried or raged. We were both too exhausted for dramatics, too depleted by years of watching our spouses drift away to waste energy on emotional outbursts. What do we do now? I asked as dawn began filtering through my kitchen windows. Anthony was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across my table. We wait, he said finally. Harper's only 6. She doesn't deserve to have her world destroyed over adult failures. That night we made a pact that would define the next 9 years of our lives. We would wait until Harper was old enough to understand the situation before confronting Thomas and Danielle. In the meantime, we would document everything. Anthony's methodical nature made him the perfect investigator. He installed tracking software on devices, photographed evidence with timestamps, and created detailed spreadsheets documenting patterns of behavior. I began paying closer attention to Thomas's interactions with Danielle during group gatherings, noting the inside jokes, the intimate glances, the way they moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of lovers rather than friends. We met monthly to share information, two wounded people finding unexpected strength in our shared betrayal. Anthony would arrive with his latest findings, and I'd share my observations from social events or conversations. It was a strange partnership, built on mutual devastation but sustained by a shared commitment to protecting Harper from the truth until she was emotionally equipped to handle it. The investigation revealed the depth of their deception. Hotel stays weren't random. They followed a careful schedule designed to avoid suspicion. Thomas's work meetings were fabricated, complete with fake client names and manufactured project deadlines. Danielle had created an elaborate system of alibis involving fictional friends and imaginary commitments. What hurt most wasn't just the affair itself, but the calculated nature of their betrayal. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a spontaneous attraction that spiraled out of control. This was a deliberate, ongoing deception that required planning, coordination, and a complete disregard for the people they'd promised to love and protect. As Harper grew older, Thomas's involvement in her life intensified rather than diminished, making our situation increasingly complex and painful to navigate. Then I got sick. The autoimmune diagnosis came 3 years into Anthony's and my secret investigation, hitting me like a freight train when I thought I was finally gaining ground in understanding the depth of Thomas and Danielle's betrayal. What started as persistent fatigue and joint pain escalated into something that required immediate hospitalization and long-term treatment. I expected Thomas to step up. Despite everything I knew about his affair, some foolish part of me still believed that serious illness might remind him of his wedding vows, in sickness and in health for better or worse. Instead, his hospital visits became increasingly perfunctory, brief obligations fulfilled with the minimum effort required to avoid looking completely heartless to the medical staff. "How are you feeling today?" he'd ask, standing near the door like he was ready to bolt at the first opportunity. "Tired," I'd answer honestly. "The treatment is rough, but the doctors think." "That's good. I'm glad you're getting the care you need." He'd glance at his watch, then at his phone, anywhere except at me lying in that hospital bed. "I should get going. Work's been crazy lately." Work. Always work. The same fictional work commitments that provided cover for his hotel meetings with Danielle. Meanwhile, Harper visited me every single day after school. At 9 years old, she'd arrive with her backpack full of homework, spreading math worksheets across my hospital tray table and asking for help with reading assignments. She'd show me her drawings, tell me about playground drama, and curl up in the visitor's chair to watch cartoons on the tiny television mounted to the wall. "Why doesn't Thomas come to see you more?" Harper asked one afternoon, her innocent question cutting straight to the heart of my loneliness. "He's very busy with work," I replied, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Daddy Anthony says work is never more important than family," Harper said matter-of-factly, then returned to coloring a get-well card she was making for me. Anthony had quietly stepped into the void Thomas created, handling my medical paperwork, driving me to specialist appointments, and ensuring I had everything I needed during the long stretches when Thomas was conspicuously absent. The contrast between the two men became stark and painful, one proving his loyalty through actions while the other demonstrated his priorities through neglect. For 6 years, Harper remained my constant companion and source of joy during the darkest period of my life. Even as my health improved and I was able to return home, she continued her daily visits, now helping with my art projects and listening to me read chapters from my latest children's books. But something shifted after Harper's 15th birthday. The daily visits stopped abruptly. At first, I assumed it was normal teenage behavior. Friends becoming more important, social activities taking priority, the natural distancing that happens as children grow into adolescence. When a week passed without seeing her, I called Thomas. "Where's Harper been? I haven't seen her since last Tuesday." Thomas's response was dismissive, almost irritated. "She's 15 now, Rachel. She's got her own life. Friends, activities, teenage stuff. She can't be expected to visit you every day like when she was little." But something in his tone suggested there was more to Harper's absence than normal adolescent development. When I mentioned it to Anthony during one of our monthly meetings, his expression darkened. "Thomas has been talking to Harper," Anthony said quietly. "Telling her things about you that aren't true." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "What kind of things?" "That you're bitter and jealous of their family happiness. That your illness was exaggerated for attention. That you've been manipulative and possessive, trying to break up his relationship with Danielle." Anthony's hands clenched into fists on my kitchen table. "He's convinced her that you're the problem in all of this." The systematic poisoning of Harper against me was perhaps the cruelest thing Thomas had done yet. This child who had been my anchor during the worst years of my life, who had shown more loyalty and love than my own husband, was now being manipulated into believing I was the villain in a story she didn't fully understand. I tried calling Harper directly, but she didn't answer. I sent texts that went unread. The teenager who had once spent every afternoon in my hospital room now treated me like a stranger she wanted to avoid. Thomas had successfully isolated me from everyone I loved, believing I was too weak and sick to fight back. He underestimated how much strength can be forged in the furnace of betrayal and abandonment. 2 years passed this way. 2 years of increasing isolation while my health stabilized and my career quietly exploded into unprecedented success. Publishers were competing for my next series. International rights deals were materializing faster than my agent could negotiate them. Movie studios were calling about adaptation rights. But professionally, success felt meaningless when my personal life had been systematically destroyed by the man who was supposed to protect and cherish me. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. I was reviewing illustrations on my laptop, putting finishing touches on artwork for my latest book deal, when Thomas walked into my hospital room during one of my routine follow-up appointments. But this wasn't the sheepish, guilty Thomas I'd grown accustomed to during his brief, uncomfortable visits. This Thomas walked with swagger, chest puffed out with arrogance I'd never seen before. And he wasn't alone. Danielle clung to his arm possessively, wearing the triumphant smile of someone who believed she'd finally won a prize she'd been coveting for years. Her engagement ring, a ring that should have been my upgrade someday, caught the harsh fluorescent lighting as she squeezed Thomas's bicep encouragingly. They had dressed for this moment. Thomas wore his best suit, the one I'd helped him pick out for job interviews years ago. Danielle had styled her hair perfectly and chosen an outfit that screamed confidence and victory. This wasn't a spontaneous visit. This was a performance they'd planned and rehearsed. Thomas approached my hospital bed with theatrical flair, pulling a business card from his jacket pocket like a magician revealing his final trick. He dropped it on my bedside table with deliberate precision, the small piece of cardstock landing with a sharp slap against the surface. "My lawyer's contact information," he announced, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering what he believed was devastating news. "We're getting divorced." The audacity of the timing, serving divorce papers to your hospitalized wife, revealed a level of cruelty I hadn't known he possessed. But worse than the timing was the obvious satisfaction he took in what he believed was my complete powerlessness to resist. Danielle squeezed his arm again, prompting him to continue his prepared speech like a director encouraging an actor to deliver his lines with more conviction. "You don't work," Thomas continued, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact, "so you'll pay me alimony. $1,000 a month seems fair, don't you think?" The absurdity of demanding financial support from a woman lying in a hospital bed revealed just how completely he'd misunderstood my actual circumstances. But his next words were designed purely to wound. "I'm done being tied to a lazy, worthless woman," he sneered, his contempt so complete and dismissive that I finally understood our entire marriage had been built on lies. This was who Thomas really was when he thought I had no power to fight back. Cruel, calculating, completely convinced of his own superiority. Danielle nodded sympathetically beside him, playing her role as the understanding new partner who supported his difficult decision to abandon his sick wife. They had constructed an elaborate narrative where I was the villain, the burden, the obstacle to their deserved happiness, the dead weight that had been holding Thomas back from his true potential. But instead of the breakdown they'd clearly anticipated, something unexpected happened. Years of hidden hurt and suppressed anger crystallized into cold, clear determination. I felt a strange sense of liberation wash over me, as if Thomas's cruelty had finally freed me from any lingering guilt about destroying his life. I looked at Thomas, then at Danielle, and smiled genuinely for the first time in months. "Fine," I said simply. "Let's get divorced." Thomas blinked, clearly thrown off script. He'd prepared for tears, for desperate bargaining, for the emotional collapse that would validate his narrative about my instability. My calm acceptance wasn't part of their carefully rehearsed performance. "Fine." Danielle's voice cracked slightly. "That's it? You're just going to agree? What did you expect?" I asked pleasantly, closing my laptop with deliberate care. "You've made your choice. I'm simply accepting it." Behind Thomas's surprise, I could see confusion flickering across both their faces. They had scripted this confrontation expecting drama that would confirm their story about my emotional instability. Instead, they were getting serene agreement from a woman who seemed almost relieved by their news. "Well, good," Thomas stammered, trying to regain his composure. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this." "Oh, I'm being very reasonable," I replied, and something in my tone made him shift uncomfortably. They left my hospital room that afternoon with less satisfaction than they'd anticipated, but still convinced they'd won. Thomas had no idea he'd just lit the fuse on his own destruction. The moment they were gone, I opened my laptop and began making calls. First to my lawyer, then to my accountant, then to my business manager. The woman who had spent years downplaying her success was done pretending to be weak. That evening, I made the call that would change everything. "Sarah, it's Rachel," I said when my lawyer answered. "Remember that house discussion we had last year about asset protection? The property registration under your business name? Of course. I need you to cancel Thomas's lease immediately. Begin eviction proceedings first thing tomorrow morning." There was a pause on the other end. "Rachel, are you sure? That's going to create quite a shock for him." "That's exactly what I'm counting on." 10 days later, while I was still completing my final round of treatments, my phone rang with the confirmation I'd been waiting for. The sheriff had delivered the eviction notice. Thomas had 72 hours to vacate the premises. His first voicemail arrived within an hour. "What the hell is this?" Thomas's voice was shrill with panic. "You can't just kick us out. This is illegal. I'm calling my lawyer." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. The second call came 20 minutes later. "Rachel, pick up the phone. Where are we supposed to go? Danielle's got Harper to think about. You can't just throw a child out on the street." Interesting how quickly Harper became a convenient shield when Thomas needed to play victim. The third call was different. Thomas had clearly been coached, probably by whatever lawyer he'd managed to reach on short notice. "Rachel, I know you're upset, but we need to discuss this rationally. Let's work out some kind of arrangement until the divorce is finalized. I'm willing to pay fair market rent." I answered this one. "Thomas," I said calmly, "the house is registered under my business name. You've been living there rent-free for 8 years as a courtesy that I'm now withdrawing. The lease cancellation is completely legal. Your lawyer can confirm that. But where are we supposed to go?" "That's between you and your lawyer," I replied, then hung up. The beauty of my legal position was its simplicity. Thomas had never contributed to the down payment, never been added to the deed, never even paid utilities. He'd been living in my property as a guest, and guests can be asked to leave. Within a week, Thomas and Danielle had been forced to move in with his parents, a humiliating arrangement that put their affair on full display for his family. Margaret, Thomas's mother, had always prided herself on raising a son with strong moral character. Watching him abandon his sick wife for his best friend's spouse shattered her illusions about her perfect boy. 3 weeks later, I was finally released from the hospital. Anthony picked me up, and we drove directly to the modest ranch house where Thomas had grown up. It was time for the confrontation I'd been planning since that terrible day in my hospital room. The moment I walked through the front door with Anthony beside me, Thomas's face drained of color. He hadn't expected me to recover so quickly, and he certainly hadn't anticipated me arriving with backup. Especially not the backup he'd betrayed just as thoroughly as he'd betrayed me. "Rachel," he started, but I held up a hand to silence him. Harper was there, sitting in the corner of the living room looking deeply uncomfortable. At 16, she was old enough to sense the adult tensions swirling around her but still young enough to be confused about her role in all of it. Danielle immediately tried to take control of the situation, launching into a defensive speech that revealed just how entitled she'd become. "I don't know why everyone's being so dramatic about this," she declared, standing up from the couch with theatrical authority. "Thomas and I found real love together. That's something to celebrate, not punish. Besides," she gestured toward Harper, "his parents are getting a blood grandchild now. That has to count for something." The audacity was breathtaking. She truly believed that her affair and Harper's existence trumped all other considerations. Marriage vows, loyalty, basic human decency. But what happened next was worth every moment of pain I'd endured over the past decade. Harper looked up from where she'd been staring at her hands, her young face carrying a maturity that spoke to everything she'd witnessed and processed over the years. She looked directly at Thomas, the man who had played father to her for 10 years, who had attended every school event and soccer practice, who had prioritized her needs over his own marriage. "My dad is Anthony," she said clearly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "That's the only dad I want." The silence that followed was profound and devastating. Thomas's face crumbled as if Harper had physically struck him. All those years of school conferences, bedtime stories, and soccer practices, reduced to nothing by one teenager's honest declaration of loyalty to the man who had actually earned the title of father. Danielle looked stricken, finally realizing that her daughter's allegiance lay with her legal father, not her mother's affair partner. In one sentence, Harper had destroyed the foundation of their entire justification for their betrayal. "Harper," Thomas began, his voice broken. "No," she interrupted. "I know what you did. Dad, Anthony told me everything. How you and Mom lied to everyone for years. How you hurt Rachel when she was sick. How you made me stop visiting her by telling me lies about her being jealous and manipulative." Thomas's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then Anthony delivered the legal revelation that completed Danielle's destruction. "Oh, by the way," he said with quiet satisfaction, pulling a folder from his jacket, "you and I are still legally married, Danielle. Our divorce papers were never finalized due to a technicality I chose not to correct." The color drained from Danielle's face as the implications crashed over her. Her marriage to Thomas was completely invalid. She had no legal standing as his spouse, no claim to any shared assets, no protection under spousal privilege laws. Worse still, she could potentially face bigamy charges if anyone chose to pursue them. Anthony had been meticulous in his revenge planning, using his technical expertise to exploit every legal loophole while Danielle played house with another woman's husband. Thomas, desperate to salvage something from the complete wreckage of his plans, made one final attempt at intimidation. "So what?" he sneered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You're sick, Rachel. You'll be broke in a year, dead in 2. What are you really going to do?" That was my cue for the greatest revelation of all. I pulled out my phone with deliberate calm and opened my banking app, turning the screen toward them. "I make $450,000 a year now," I said quietly. "I'm a best-selling children's author with a movie deal in production. Want to see my royalty statements?" Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally desperate calculation. In the span of 10 seconds, I watched him process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about our power dynamic. $450,000, he repeated slowly, as if saying the number would somehow make it less real. "Per year," I confirmed, scrolling through my phone to show monthly deposit screenshots. "Royalty checks, licensing deals, international rights. My Brave Little Fox series is being translated into 12 languages. The movie deal I mentioned? Netflix just greenlit it for production." Danielle's grip on Thomas's arm tightened until her knuckles went white. I could practically see her brain recalculating everything: the comfortable life she thought she was gaining, the financial security she'd assumed would come with stealing my husband, the future she'd built in her imagination. Thomas's transformation was immediate and nauseating. Rachel, he said, his voice suddenly honeyed with the charm he'd used when we first met. Maybe we're being hasty here. We've been together for 15 years. That has to count for something. What are you doing? Danielle's voice rose to a shriek. I'm trying to salvage our family, Thomas replied smoothly, never taking his eyes off my phone screen. Rachel, we could work this out. Go to counseling. Take some time to rebuild what we had. The audacity was breathtaking. Within minutes of demanding alimony from his lazy, worthless wife, he was ready to reconcile now that he understood my actual net worth. But Danielle's scream of betrayal cut through his calculated charm. Are you serious right now? After everything we've risked? After all the promises you made? She turned to face him fully, and I saw the exact moment she realized Thomas would abandon her the instant a better option appeared. Exactly as he had abandoned me when he thought she was the better option. This is what he does, I said quietly to Danielle. He finds someone useful and discards them when they stop serving his purposes. Thomas's father, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke from his position by the fireplace. Get out, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a successful business through decades of hard work and integrity. Both of you, out of my house. Dad, Thomas started, but his father held up a weathered hand. I raised you better than this, Thomas. I taught you about loyalty, about keeping your word, about standing by the people who love you. His disappointment was crushing to witness. Learning that you abandoned your sick wife for this situation, it makes me question everything I thought I knew about the son I raised. Within the week, Thomas was fired from his father's construction company, the comfortable position he'd assumed would always be there as his safety net. His father arranged for him to work on a commercial fishing boat, the kind of back-breaking, dangerous labor that paid minimum wage and required pre-dawn departures regardless of weather conditions. The irony was poetic justice at its finest. The man who had sneered about my laziness was now working 16-hour days hauling nets and processing fish, coming home exhausted and reeking of the ocean, barely making enough to survive in a tiny apartment he shared with 2 other crew members. Meanwhile, his former colleagues whispered about his downfall, ensuring he'd never find comparable employment in the local business community. Word traveled fast in our circles about the man who'd abandoned his hospitalized wife for his best friend's spouse. Danielle's collapse was even more spectacular. Without Thomas's income and with no legal claim to any shared assets due to her invalid marriage, her entire lifestyle evaporated overnight. Anthony filed for immediate custody modification, presenting documented evidence of her infidelity, abandonment of parental responsibilities, and the instability her bigamous relationship had created for Harper. The family court judge was particularly harsh on Danielle's deception, noting that her invalid second marriage demonstrated a pattern of dishonesty that made her unsuitable as Harper's primary guardian. Ms. Morrison, the judge said during the custody hearing, your choices have created an environment of instability and moral confusion that is detrimental to your daughter's well-being. Danielle was ordered to supervised visitation only, forced to work 2 part-time jobs just to afford a studio apartment across town. Her carefully cultivated friendships, built on gossip and superficial connections, couldn't survive the scandal. Former friends avoided her calls and crossed the street when they saw her in public. She became a cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties and book clubs, the beautiful woman who had destroyed everything for a man who ultimately abandoned her the moment someone more valuable appeared. Thomas stopped taking her calls within 3 months, leaving her completely alone with the consequences of their shared betrayal. But the most meaningful restoration came through Harper's gradual return to my life. As the truth about Thomas's manipulation came to light, Harper began reaching out tentatively through text messages, then phone calls, and finally awkward but genuine visits to my house. I'm sorry, was the first thing she said when she appeared at my door 6 months after the confrontation. I should have known better. You were never jealous or manipulative. Thomas lied to me about everything. Our conversations were stilted at first, both of us navigating the damage that years of lies and manipulation had created. But slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding the connection we'd shared during her childhood. Harper was studying languages at community college, dreaming of becoming a translator. Her eyes lit up when I told her about the international publishers interested in adapting my books for global audiences. I could help you translate your stories, she said excitedly during one of our Sunday dinners. Imagine brave little fox teaching courage to children in Spain or Germany or Japan. Watching her enthusiasm reminded me why I'd loved her so fiercely as a child. She had inherited Anthony's steady character and intellectual curiosity, not her mother's manipulative tendencies. Our renewed bond felt stronger than our original connection, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than childhood innocence. Anthony's proposal came on a quiet Sunday evening as we sat at my kitchen table reviewing the legal documents that had finalized both our divorces. We'd been meeting weekly for months, ostensibly to handle the aftermath of our respective legal battles, but really because we'd become each other's anchor through the storm. "I know this might seem too soon," he said, setting down his pen and looking directly at me, "but we've been through hell together. We know each other's worst moments and we're still here." His proposal wasn't romantic in any traditional sense. There were no flowers, no dramatic gestures, no passionate declarations of undying love. Instead, it was practical, honest, and based on proven compatibility and shared values. "We've already survived betrayal, illness, and legal warfare as a team," he continued. "Our partnership has been tested in ways most couples never face. I think we could build something real together, something based on actual trust instead of pretty lies." I appreciated his honesty about the timing and circumstances. We weren't two young people falling in love for the first time. We were two wounded adults who had found strength in each other's company. "I need time to think," I told him, "but I'm not saying no." The possibility of building something genuine with someone who had proven his loyalty through actions rather than words was appealing. But I wanted to choose it freely, as a celebration of our future rather than a reaction to our shared trauma. 6 months later, I stood in my new art studio, a bright, spacious room in the house I'd reclaimed from Thomas, now transformed into something entirely mine. Sunlight streamed through windows I had enlarged, illuminating canvases covered with illustrations for my latest book series. My phone buzzed with another call from a Hollywood executive interested in adaptation rights. The movie deal I'd casually mentioned during that confrontation was now moving into pre-production, with A-list voice actors attached to bring brave little fox to life on screen. My health had stabilized completely with proper treatment and the dramatic reduction in stress that came with removing toxic people from my life. Most importantly, I had learned to value myself properly, not just my financial success, but my worth as a person who deserved loyalty, honesty, and respect. The woman who had once hidden her achievements to protect her husband's fragile ego was now confidently building an empire, making decisions based on what served my goals rather than what made others comfortable. Every morning, I woke up grateful for the divorce that had set me free to become who I was always meant to be. Thomas had called me lazy and worthless, but his cruel words had become the catalyst for me to claim my full power and create the life I truly wanted. And the look on his face when he realized what he'd lost? Absolutely priceless. If this story of perfect revenge had you cheering for Rachel, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Rachel revealed her $450,000 income and watched Thomas's face crumble in real time. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.
I'm Miranda, 32, and I survived being pushed from a helicopter by my own sister. Ashley and my husband Brent plotted my death for a $5 million insurance payout. Everyone thought I was dead for weeks while I fought to survive in the Alaskan wilderness. The look on their faces when I walked into my own funeral? Priceless. Before I dive into this nightmare, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe to join me on this wild journey of betrayal and survival. Growing up, Ashley and I were inseparable. Two sisters born just 3 years apart, we shared everything from clothes to secrets to dreams. When our parents died in a car accident when I was 20 and Ashley was 23, our bond seemed unbreakable. We only had each other now, and the modest inheritance our parents left behind. Ashley was always the responsible one, cautious, planning everything meticulously, while I was more of a risk-taker. I used my portion of the inheritance to start a tech consulting business that thrived beyond my wildest expectations. Within 5 years, my company was valued at over $15 million, and I was featured in Business Weekly as one of the top 30 under 30 entrepreneurs to watch. Ashley took a different path. She invested her inheritance in what seemed like a stable retail franchise, but a combination of poor location, economic downturn, and possibly mismanagement led to its failure within 2 years. She lost almost everything and had to start over working entry-level marketing jobs, struggling to pay off the business debts she'd accumulated. I never lorded my success over her. In fact, I offered to help numerous times, but Ashley had too much pride. "I'll figure it out myself," she always said with that tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. I respected her independence, but looking back, I should have seen the resentment building beneath the surface. The sidelong glances when I mentioned a new client, the slight stiffening when I talked about buying my lakeside house, the forced enthusiasm when I took her shopping and insisted on paying. That's where Brent came into my life, at a charity gala I was sponsoring for child literacy. He was working the event as a financial advisor to some of the wealthy donors. Tall, with dark wavy hair and an easy laugh that made everyone feel special, Brent caught my attention immediately. He approached me with a glass of champagne and a compliment about my speech that was specific enough to show he'd actually been listening. "You connected educational opportunity to innovation in a way that made even the tech-averse dinosaurs in this room perk up," he said, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's a rare gift." Our connection was immediate and intense. Within 3 months, we were living together. By 6 months, he had proposed with a vintage emerald ring that showed he'd been paying attention when I mentioned once that diamonds felt too obvious. At our wedding a year after meeting, Ashley was my maid of honor, beaming beside me in the photos that would later be displayed at my funeral. What I didn't know then was that Brent's career was in trouble. He'd made some ethically questionable investment recommendations to clients that hadn't yet come to light, but had forced him to switch firms twice in the year before we met. His charming persona and network kept him employed, but his income was nowhere near what he implied. When we merged our finances after marriage, I was surprised to find substantial debt and minimal savings, but he explained it away as investing in himself through advanced certifications and temporary setbacks. I believed him completely. That was my first mistake. Looking back, there were signs that Ashley and Brent had an unusual connection from the start. They laughed at the same obscure jokes, often completed each other's sentences, and sometimes I'd walk into a room to find them in deep conversation that would abruptly shift when I appeared. I thought it was wonderful that my sister and husband got along so well. Their closeness seemed like a blessing. "You're so lucky," my friend Jessica told me once. "Most women have to deal with their husband and sister hating each other. You've got the dream team." The dream team. What a joke that would turn out to be. The first real sign that something was off came about 2 years into my marriage. I came home early from a business trip to surprise Brent and overheard him and Ashley in our kitchen. They weren't doing anything inappropriate, just talking, but their voices had an intensity, a secrecy that made me pause outside the door. "She'd never agree to it," Ashley whispered. "You know how she is about control." "We don't have to decide anything now," Brent replied. "But the opportunity won't last forever." When I walked in, they jumped apart like guilty teenagers, explaining they were discussing a surprise birthday party for me. I accepted the explanation, even though my birthday was still 5 months away. I wanted to believe them. Then financial documents started disappearing from my home office. Investment statements, insurance policies, the business succession plan I'd created with my lawyers. When I mentioned the missing papers, Brent suggested I was working too hard and misplacing things. He even helped me search for them, eventually finding them filed in the wrong folders. There were strange reactions, too, when I talked about future plans. Mentions of our 5th anniversary trip to Japan were met with vague enthusiasm from Brent. When I talked about expanding my business to international markets, which would require more travel for me, both Ashley and Brent seemed oddly interested in the logistics of how long I'd be gone and how often. Brent began having unexplained absences, networking events that couldn't be verified, client meetings that ran mysteriously late, golf games that left no mud on his shoes. When questioned, he'd get defensive, accusing me of not trusting him. "You're so suspicious lately," he'd say. "Is this how it's going to be forever?" You, successful and doubting me at every turn? The guilt would work every time. I'd back down, apologize, remind myself that relationships require trust. I ignored the red flags because I wanted to believe in the life I thought we were building. I didn't want to be the suspicious, controlling wife. I wanted to be the supportive partner who believed in her husband unconditionally. That unconditional trust would nearly cost me my life. The invitation to the helicopter tour came as part of my annual executive retreat in Alaska. Every year, my company's leadership team spent a week at a luxury wilderness lodge, combining strategic planning with outdoor adventures. This particular year, we were scheduled to take helicopter tours of the glaciers and remote mountain ranges, a highlight of the trip that everyone looked forward to. 2 weeks before the retreat, during Sunday brunch at our house, I mentioned the helicopter tours to Ashley and Brent. "It sounds amazing," Ashley said, her eyes lighting up with what I now recognize as calculation rather than excitement. "I've always wanted to see Alaska from the air." "You should come with me," I suggested impulsively. "The company has a friends and family day. You could join for the helicopter tour and the evening banquet." I expected her to decline. Ashley usually avoided my company events, saying they made her feel like the poor relation. But this time, she immediately accepted. "I could use a mini vacation," she said. "Things have been so stressful at work lately." Brent encouraged the idea enthusiastically. "You two haven't had sister time in ages. It's perfect." That same week, Brent brought up the subject of life insurance. We already had policies through my company, but he suggested we needed additional coverage. "Your business is growing," he reasoned. "We need to make sure everything's protected in case something happens to you. What if a client sues? What if there's an accident?" His concerns seemed reasonable. As the primary breadwinner with a growing company, additional insurance made sense. I agreed to the policy without much thought. $5 million that would go to Brent if I died, with Ashley named as the secondary beneficiary, just in case, as Brent suggested. The insurance agent seemed surprised at the amount and asked several questions about why we needed such extensive coverage so quickly. Brent smoothly explained it was for business liability protection and estate planning purposes. His background in financial services made his explanation sound legitimate, and I was too busy with quarter-end reports to pay much attention to the details. As the trip approached, Brent became increasingly affectionate and attentive. He planned special dinners, brought home flowers for no reason, and kept telling me to enjoy every moment of my trip. At the time, I interpreted this as loving support. Now I recognize it as the guilty conscience of a man saying goodbye. The night before my departure, he held me longer than usual. "I need you to know how much you mean to me," he said, his voice thick with what I thought was emotion but was probably just well-practiced deception. "Ashley gave me an unusual gift the morning of my flight, an expensive bottle of perfume. It's your favorite," she insisted, though I'd never worn that scent before. I spritzed it on to please her, not realizing she wanted me heavily scented to mask any other smells later, like fear or adrenaline, that might alert the pilot to something amiss. When we arrived in Alaska, the beauty of the landscape momentarily made me forget any lingering concerns. The jagged mountains, ancient glaciers, and vast wilderness created a sense of peaceful insignificance. How small human problems seemed in such a majestic setting. The morning of the helicopter tour dawned clear and bright, perfect flying conditions. Ashley seemed unusually interested in the details of our excursion. "Which route are we taking? How long will we be in the air? How many people per helicopter? Are the doors removed for better photos?" Her questions seemed excessive, but I attributed her intensity to excitement. We were assigned to a helicopter with just one other passenger, an older gentleman from my finance team who, at the last minute, complained of altitude sickness and didn't board. That left just Ashley, me, and the pilot, a gruff local named Tom who had been flying these routes for 20 years. As we lifted off, Ashley clutched her seat with white knuckles. I teased her about being nervous, not recognizing that her anxiety stemmed from what she was planning to do, not fear of flying. About 30 minutes into our flight, we were hovering over a particularly remote area of wilderness, miles from any trails or ranger stations. Tom received a call on his radio and explained he needed to check something with the ground crew. Just a quick stop at this service station, he explained, pointing to a small outpost below. Fuel gauge is acting funny. Won't take more than 5 minutes. He landed smoothly on a small pad, turned to us and said, "Sit tight, ladies. Keep your harnesses on. I'll be right back." The moment he stepped out, Ashley's demeanor changed completely. The nervous sister was replaced by someone calculating and cold. "Let's get some photos while he's gone," she suggested, unbuckling her harness. The view from the door would be amazing. I followed her, trusting as always. She opened the helicopter door, the rush of mountain air hitting us both. I stepped toward the opening, camera ready. "The light is perfect," I said, looking out at the wilderness below. "Perfect for what I need to do," Ashley replied. I turned, confused by her tone, just in time to see her expression harden with resolve. In that moment, her face became a stranger's, cold, determined, without a trace of sisterly love. Her hands connected with my shoulders in a violent push. There was no hesitation, no sign of inner conflict. I remember her eyes most clearly, flat and businesslike, as if she were merely completing a transaction. The force sent me tumbling backward, out of the helicopter. As I fell, our eyes met one final time. She didn't look away or show remorse. Instead, she reached for the door handle to close it, already moving on to the next step in her plan. Then I was falling, the helicopter growing smaller above me, the vast Alaskan wilderness rushing up to meet me. The human body falls at about 120 miles per hour in a free drop. But I wasn't in a free drop. My body tumbled and spun, creating drag. And then there were the trees, the dense pine forest that both saved and nearly killed me. I crashed through the upper branches, each impact slowing my descent, but also inflicting damage. Ribs cracked.
Skin tore.
A branch as thick as my arm connected with my left leg, snapping the femur with a sickening sound that somehow registered even through my terror. The final impact knocked me unconscious. When I came to, minutes or hours later, I couldn't tell. The physical pain hit me in waves of such intensity that I vomited. My tailored business suit was shredded, one pump missing, blood soaking through the silk blouse I'd chosen so carefully that morning. But the physical agony paled compared to the emotional impact of what had happened. My sister had tried to murder me. My own flesh and blood had looked me in the eyes and pushed me to what should have been my death. And Brent, he must have known. The insurance policy, the sudden interest in my trip details, the strange goodbye. They had planned this together. I screamed then, a primal sound of rage and betrayal that scattered nearby birds from their perches. I screamed until my throat was raw, until the pain in my chest from my broken ribs forced me to stop. And then, lying there in the wilderness, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I would not die. I would survive, not just for justice, but for the pure defiance of ruining their carefully laid plans. The first task was assessing my injuries. The broken femur was the most serious and immediately threatening. I couldn't walk, and an untreated break like that could lead to fat embolism, infection, or deadly blood loss. Using strips torn from my suit jacket and broken branches from around me, I constructed a crude splint. The process nearly made me pass out multiple times, but I kept going, focusing on Ashley's face as she pushed me, using my rage as anesthesia. Next was shelter. The Alaska wilderness, even in summer, gets dangerously cold at night. I dragged myself under a fallen log, creating a small protected space lined with pine boughs for insulation. My watch, miraculously still working, told me it was late afternoon. I had maybe 4 hours of daylight left. Water would be critical. I could hear a stream nearby, but couldn't reach it with my broken leg. Instead, I tore the silk lining from my jacket and stretched it over a depression in the ground, creating a collection device for dew and any rain that might fall. As night approached, the temperature dropped dramatically. I was dressed for a climate-controlled helicopter and business meeting, not wilderness survival. Hypothermia, became my most immediate threat. I pulled every pine branch and piece of forest debris I could reach into my makeshift shelter, creating layers between me and the cold ground. I wrapped my torso in the remains of my suit jacket, leaving my injured leg elevated on a mound of gathered moss. Through that first night, drifting between consciousness and delirium, I had plenty of time to think. Why had Ashley done this? The insurance money, obviously, but was that all? Had she hated me all these years while pretending to be the loving sister? Had every shared birthday, every holiday, every late-night conversation been a lie? And Brent, had anything in our marriage been real? The questions circled like hungry wolves, but I forced them away. Psychological autopsy could wait. Survival came first. Dawn brought rain, both blessing and curse. I managed to collect enough water in my silk lining to quench my raging thirst, but the dampness made controlling my body temperature even more difficult. By midday, I was shivering uncontrollably, a bad sign. I needed to signal for help, but in this remote area, who would see? The diamond earrings Brent had given me for our anniversary became tools. I placed one on a rock where sunlight might hit it and create a reflection visible from the air. The other I kept as a cutting tool, using the hard edge to sharpen sticks and slice through the tougher materials of my clothing to create bandages for my numerous cuts. The second day brought fever. Infection was setting in, either from my leg or one of the many lacerations covering my body. I chewed pine needles, having vaguely remembered reading about their vitamin C content and antiseptic properties. The bitter taste was oddly comforting. At least I was doing something, fighting in some small way. By the third day, I was slipping in and out of consciousness more frequently. The pain had become a constant companion, almost separate from me. I named it Ashley, which seemed fitting. In more lucid moments, I focused on my business training, problem-solving, resource allocation, critical path analysis. I'd built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. Surely I could survive this. I created mental flowcharts for different scenarios. If rescue came, what information would I need to remember? If the fever worsened, what were my options? If an animal discovered my shelter, how would I defend myself? The structured thinking kept panic at bay and gave me the illusion of control in a situation where I had almost none. On what I believe was the fourth day, voices woke me from a feverish dream about falling. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, but the sounds persisted, human voices calling back and forth to each other. Through here. Watch that drop-off. How much farther to the summit? Hikers. Recreational hikers on a trail I had known was relatively close by. With every ounce of strength remaining, I called out, a hoarse, broken sound that seemed too weak to travel more than a few feet. I tried again, louder, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs. The voices stopped. Then, did you hear that? Probably just a bird. No, listen, there it is again. I kept calling, using my good leg to bang a stick against a nearby log for additional noise. The minutes stretched agonizingly until suddenly, foliage parted, and two shocked faces appeared, a young couple in bright outdoor gear, utterly unprepared for the bloody, broken woman they found in the wilderness. "Oh my God," the woman whispered. "Jared, call for emergency evac now." The man fumbled for a satellite phone. "What happened? Who are you?" "My name is Miranda Taylor," I managed to say. "My sister pushed me from a helicopter 4 days ago. She and my husband are trying to kill me for insurance money." Their expressions would have been comical under different circumstances: shock, disbelief, and the awkward uncertainty of how to respond to such an outlandish statement. "Let's focus on getting you help first," the woman, who introduced herself as Rachel, said diplomatically. "Everything else can wait." The rescue helicopter arrived within 2 hours, the cruel irony of being saved by the same type of aircraft that had been the instrument of my intended murder was not lost on me. The emergency medics were efficient and kind, expressing amazement that I had survived both the fall and 4 days in the wilderness with such severe injuries. As they loaded me into the helicopter, I heard one medic say to another, "Isn't this near where that executive woman went missing earlier this week?" The one who fell during a photo op? They've been searching the Western Quadrant, but there was no sign. My blood ran cold. They had reported my accident, but deliberately misdirected the search efforts. Of course, Ashley and Brent would need a body for the insurance payout. They would have told authorities approximately where I fell, but given them incorrect coordinates to ensure I wouldn't be found until it was too late. In the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness through a haze of pain medication and surgery, I caught fragments of conversations among the nurses. Poor thing, such a tragedy. Husband on his way from Seattle. Sister already identified her belongings. Funeral being planned for next week. They thought I was just another patient. They had no idea they were discussing my own death with me. Somewhere in the hospital billing system, I was a Miranda Taylor, attempted murder victim. I was Jane Doe, hiking accident, found miles from where Miranda Taylor had reportedly fallen to her death. The perfect cover for what would become my greatest advantage, the element of surprise. I spent 3 days in and out of surgeries before I was lucid enough to fully understand my situation. By then, according to the snippets of news I could gather from the hospital television, the search for my body had been called off due to dangerous conditions. The narrative being reported was tragic but straightforward. Successful businesswoman Miranda Taylor had accidentally fallen while taking photos during a helicopter tour of Alaska. Her body was presumed lost in the vast wilderness. What struck me most was how quickly Brent and Ashley had moved to cement this story. There were already quotes from both of them in the news articles, heartfelt statements about their devastating loss, their appreciation for the search teams, their request for privacy during this difficult time. Miranda lived life to the fullest, Brent told reporters, his voice reportedly breaking with emotion. She was always seeking the next adventure, the next beautiful view. That she died doing what she loved is our only consolation in this nightmare. Ashley's statement was equally performative. My sister was my best friend and my inspiration. I keep thinking about our last moments together, how happy she was seeing the glaciers from above. I will carry that memory with me always. The calculated precision of their lies made my blood boil. I was still struggling to process the betrayal when a new visitor entered my hospital room. Not a doctor or nurse, but a woman in a sharp pantsuit who introduced herself as Detective Lauren Reeves. The hikers who found you reported some concerning claims you made, she said, pulling up a chair beside my bed. About being pushed from a helicopter? By your sister? For a moment, I considered backtracking. Who would believe such an outlandish story? But something in Detective Reeves' straightforward gaze told me she wasn't there to dismiss me. It's true, I said. Every word of it. My sister Ashley pushed me from that helicopter, and I'm certain my husband Brent was part of the plan. I expected skepticism, but instead, she nodded thoughtfully. The coordinates where you were found are nowhere near where your sister and the pilot reported your fall. That was the first red flag. The second was the insurance policy your husband tried to expedite a claim on yesterday, $5 million, taken out just 3 weeks ago. My heart pounded painfully against my broken ribs. He's already trying to claim it? They both are. Your sister, as the secondary beneficiary, is helping expedite the process given the unusual circumstances. Their story is that you were leaning out for a photo when a gust of wind caught you. The pilot corroborates this. The pilot was in on it too, I said. He deliberately left us alone. Detective Reeves made notes. Here's where we stand, Miss Taylor. I believe you, but belief isn't evidence. Your sister and husband think you're dead, which gives us a unique advantage. If you're willing, I'd like to keep it that way for a little longer while we build a case. And so began my official death, a strange limbo where I was simultaneously recovering from near-fatal injuries and watching my own life be dismantled by the people I had trusted most. From my hospital bed, with Detective Reeves as my ally, I learned the full extent of the betrayal. The insurance policy was just the beginning. Ashley had been named in my will as the executor of my estate if both Brent and I died, a detail I'd forgotten from our estate planning after our parents' death. With me dead and Brent potentially implicated if questions arose, Ashley would have significant control over my company and assets during probate. Digital forensics uncovered deleted text messages between Ashley and Brent going back 18 months, long enough to establish that their relationship had evolved from friendship to affair to criminal conspiracy. Need to move timeline up, one message from Brent read. Investors asking questions about past recommendations. Alaska trip perfect, Ashley had responded. Remote, dangerous terrain, easily explained accident. There were messages about the pilot too, how much to pay him to step away at the right moment, assurances that he needn't know the full plan, just that they wanted privacy for a special sister moment near a particularly scenic area. Financial records painted an even clearer picture. Brent was in serious professional trouble. His questionable investment recommendations were actually much worse. He had been misappropriating client funds for years, moving money between accounts to hide the shortfalls. The scheme was on the verge of collapse, with regulatory authorities beginning an informal inquiry into client complaints. Ashley, meanwhile, wasn't just struggling financially. She was underwater. The business failure I knew about had led to gambling in an attempt to recover her losses, creating a spiral of debt she could never escape on her marketing salary. My death would solve both their problems at once. The most chilling discovery came from surveillance footage Detective Reeves obtained from my home security system. The night after my accident, Brent and Ashley had met at my house, supposedly to comfort each other in their grief. The cameras captured them embracing in the kitchen, not in shared sorrow but in celebration, glasses of my favorite champagne in hand. To new beginnings, Brent toasted, his face showing not a trace of the devastated widower he played for the cameras. To 5 million reasons to smile, Ashley responded, clinking her glass against his before they kissed. Watching that footage from my hospital bed, something hardened inside me. The last lingering doubts, the desperate hope that perhaps I had misunderstood something fundamental about what happened in that helicopter, all of it crystallized into cold clarity. They had tried to kill me, they thought they had succeeded, and they were celebrating. By the time I was stable enough to be moved, Detective Reeves had built a preliminary case strong enough for arrest warrants. But I wanted more than arrests. I wanted to see their faces when their perfect plan collapsed. They're planning your funeral for this Saturday, Detective Reeves told me. Small, private ceremony. Family only, plus close friends. I want to be there, I said immediately. She frowned. That's not standard procedure in an ongoing investigation. Neither is the victim being presumed dead. I need to do this, not just for the case, but for me. I need to see them, to make them see me. What I didn't say was that I needed to reclaim my power, to transform from victim to victor in one dramatic moment. After much discussion and planning, Detective Reeves reluctantly agreed. We would attend the funeral together, she as part of the investigation team monitoring the suspects, me disguised as a distant cousin from out of town, face altered enough by bruising and strategic makeup to avoid immediate recognition. The plan was simple but effective. Observe, record, and gather any additional evidence of guilt from their behavior and conversations at the funeral. Then, once most attendees had left, confront them privately with police backup nearby. Their reactions, and hopefully incriminating statements made in shock, would be recorded as evidence. As the funeral approached, I prepared myself emotionally for what would be the most surreal experience of my life, attending my own memorial service, watching people mourn a death that never happened, and coming face to face with the architects of my intended murder. What I wasn't prepared for was how the experience would change me, not just in the moment, but forever after. The morning of my funeral dawned with appropriate gloom, overcast skies threatening rain that never quite materialized, as if the weather itself was maintaining the suspense. Detective Reeves picked me up from the safe house where I'd been staying since my discharge from the hospital. I still needed a cane to walk, my body a canvas of fading bruises and healing cuts, but those visible injuries would actually help my disguise. Remember, you're Madeline Foster, second cousin from my mother's side, visiting from Chicago, I reminded myself as Detective Reeves drove us to the small chapel Brent had selected for the service. You never met Miranda personally, but felt compelled to pay respects. My transformation was subtle, but effective. Brunette hair dyed a muted auburn, colored contacts changing my blue eyes to hazel, thick-framed glasses, and makeup applied to subtly alter the appearance of my cheekbones and jawline. The lingering bruises and weight loss from my ordeal further obscured my identity. Unless someone knew to look for me, and no one would because I was supposedly dead, the disguise would hold. We parked a block away and watched as mourners began to arrive. My throat tightened at the sight of familiar faces, colleagues from my company, friends from college, neighbors from our street, all dressed in black, many openly weeping. These people genuinely believed I was dead. Their grief was real, even if the cause was manufactured. Then came the stars of this macabre show, Brent and Ashley arriving together in his black BMW. They emerged from the car with practiced solemnity, Ashley leaning slightly on Brent's arm in apparent grief. Her black dress was designer, new, I noted with a flash of anger, probably purchased with the anticipated insurance money. Brent wore a suit I had bought him for client meetings, his handsome face arranged in an expression of dignified sorrow. "Ready?" Detective Reeves asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak past the knot in my throat. We entered the chapel after most guests were seated, slipping into the back row. The setup was tasteful, my portrait, a professional headshot from my company website, surrounded by white lilies and roses, an empty urn on a pedestal since there was no body to cremate. From our position, I could see Brent and Ashley in the front row, accepting condolences with downcast eyes and murmured thanks. Occasionally, Brent would place a comforting hand on Ashley's back, or she would squeeze his arm in support, gestures that would seem appropriate to everyone else, but now screamed their true relationship to my knowing eyes. The service began with soft music, one of my favorite classical pieces, I noted with surprise. Had Brent remembered that detail, or was it Ashley, who knew my taste well enough to include it? The thought that they had used genuine knowledge of me to craft this convincing performance made me feel physically ill. The minister spoke first, offering generic platitudes about life and loss. He had never met me, that much was clear from his impersonal remarks. Then came the eulogies. Ashley approached the podium first, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. "My sister was everything to me," she began, her voice catching in what any acting coach would recognize as a practiced break. "From childhood, Miranda was my protector, my confidant, my inspiration. She achieved so much in her too short life, building a business from nothing, touching countless lives with her generosity and vision." I listened in growing disbelief as she wove truth and lies together seamlessly. Yes, I had built my business from scratch. Yes, I believed in mentoring young women in tech. But the sister she described, this saintly figure who always put family first and never let success change her kind heart, was a character invented for this audience, not the real me she had tried to murder. "Our last day together was so special," she continued, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "Seeing the wonder of Alaska from above, sharing that experience sister to sister, I'll cherish those final moments forever." Miranda died doing what she loved, seeking beauty, embracing adventure. That's how I'll remember her always. The calculated cruelty of using my actual murder as a touching anecdote made my hands shake with rage. Detective Reeves placed a steadying hand on my arm, a silent reminder to maintain our cover. When Brent took the podium, his performance was equally convincing. He spoke of our whirlwind romance, our shared dreams, the future that had been so brutally stolen by a tragic accident. He even shed actual tears, whether from genuine acting skill or the relief of getting away with murder, I couldn't tell. "Miranda was the love of my life," he said, looking down at his wedding ring. "I keep expecting her to walk through the door, laughing about how this was all a big mistake. I don't know how to live in a world without her light, her drive, her passion. But I know she would want us to carry on, to honor her memory by living with the same courage and purpose that defined her life." Several of my friends spoke next, sharing genuine memories that pierced my heart. Jessica recalling our college road trip where we got lost in 3 different states, Marco from my executive team describing how I had mentored him when no one else would take a chance on a non-traditional candidate, my elderly neighbor Mrs. Patterson tearfully sharing how I always shoveled her walkway in winter without being asked. These real moments of connection, juxtaposed against the theatrical grief of the two people who had tried to kill me, created a disorienting emotional whiplash. These people had truly cared for me, and I was sitting among them, invisible, watching them mourn. As the formal service concluded, the minister invited attendees to a small reception in the adjoining hall. The family requests that in lieu of flowers, donations be made to the Miranda Taylor Foundation for Women in Technology, which Ashley will be establishing in her sister's memory. I almost laughed aloud at that. They were already planning how to launder the insurance money through a fake charity. Their foresight was almost admirable in its thoroughness. Most attendees filed toward the reception, but a small group moved to the cemetery plot nearby where a memorial stone would be placed despite the absence of a body. This was the opportunity we had been waiting for, a more private setting for the confrontation. Detective Reeves and I followed at a distance, watching as Brent and Ashley stood together at the empty gravesite. As the last few mourners drifted away after offering final condolences, they were finally alone, or so they thought. We approached slowly, my cane tapping softly on the cemetery path. Brent noticed us first, putting on his gracious, grieving widower face. "Thank you for coming," he said automatically. "Did you know Miranda through her company?" "You could say I knew her intimately," I replied, my natural voice emerging for the first time that day. He frowned slightly, not yet recognizing me, but sensing something off in my response. Ashley was more focused on the detective beside me, perhaps noticing her professional demeanor that didn't quite fit a funeral attendee. "I'm sorry you are?" Ashley asked, her tone polite but wary. "Shocked that you would use my actual murder as a touching anecdote in your eulogy," I said, removing my glasses and staring directly into her eyes. The performance was impressive, though. Very moving. The moment of recognition was everything I had imagined during my darkest moments in the wilderness and hospital. Ashley's face drained of color, so rapidly, I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed without sound, eyes widening in pure terror, as if seeing a ghost, which in her mind, she was. Brent recovered marginally faster, taking an instinctive step backward. "This is some kind of sick joke," he managed, looking to Ashley for support but finding her frozen in shock. "No joke," Detective Reeves said, showing her badge. "Just the miraculous survival of the woman you two conspired to murder." "Miranda?" Ashley finally whispered, her voice strangled. "How? You can't be alive." "I finished for her." "Disappointed?" "I survived the fall, Ashley. I survived 4 days in the wilderness with a broken leg and internal bleeding. I survived while you were picking out your funeral outfit and planning how to spend my money." Brent's shock was morphing quickly into calculation. I could almost see him formulating denials, explanations, ways to twist this into a misunderstanding. "Baby, what are you saying? There was an accident, you fell. We've been devastated." "Stop." My voice cut through his pathetic beginnings of a lie. "We have the texts between you two. We have the financial records. We have the pilot statement about being paid to leave us alone in the helicopter. We have surveillance footage of you celebrating my death. It's over." Ashley's survival instinct finally kicked in. She turned to run, but 2 uniformed officers who had been waiting discreetly nearby moved to block her path. Brent took a different approach, falling to his knees in a show of remorse. "Miranda, please, you have to understand. We were desperate. I made mistakes with client funds. I was going to go to prison. Ashley was drowning in debt. We never wanted to hurt you. We just needed to murder me for money?" I finished coldly. "That's the definition of wanting to hurt me, Brent." As the officers moved in to make the arrests, reading them their rights with the empty gravesite as backdrop, I finally delivered the statement I had rehearsed countless times during my recovery. "You know what your biggest mistake was? Not the sloppy planning or the obvious money trail. It was underestimating me. You saw me as nothing but a cash source, not as the woman who built a multi-million-dollar company through grit and intelligence, not as someone who would fight with everything she had to survive. You thought you were writing my ending, but you only set up the beginning of a story you won't like very much. As they were led away in handcuffs, Ashley silent and shell-shocked, Brent still trying to explain and justify, I felt a complex wave of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also an immense sadness for what I had lost. Not just the sister and husband who had betrayed me, but the versions of them I had believed in for so many years. Detective Reeves stood beside me as we watched the patrol car drive away. "That was quite a performance," she said quietly. "How do you feel?" I considered the question carefully, leaning heavily on my cane. Like I've attended my own funeral and witnessed my own resurrection. "I'm not sure there's a word for that feeling." She nodded thoughtfully. "There probably should be." We turned away from the empty grave that would never be filled, at least not with me. The media would soon learn of this extraordinary turn of events, and my private drama would become public spectacle. But in this moment, walking slowly away from my own memorial service, I felt a strange sense of peace mingled with the pain. I had died in a way. The trusting woman who had boarded that helicopter was gone forever. But someone new had survived the fall, someone stronger, warier, and far less willing to mistake performance for love. The media frenzy that followed was inevitable and overwhelming. Back from the dead, CEO survives murder plot by sister and husband, screamed the headlines. Every news outlet wanted an exclusive on what they called the helicopter heiress story, a nickname I detested but couldn't escape. My face was suddenly everywhere, my private trauma dissected for public consumption. I declined all interviews initially, focusing instead on the legal proceedings that would determine Ashley and Brent's fate. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie Montgomery, warned me that cases like this, even with substantial evidence, could be unpredictable. "They've hired separate defense teams," she explained during our first meeting. "That's good for us. It means they'll likely turn on each other rather than presenting a united front." She was right. Within weeks of their arrest, the carefully constructed partnership between Ashley and Brent disintegrated completely. Their betrayal of me evolved into mutual betrayal, each attempting to minimize their own culpability by maximizing the other's. Brent's defense strategy emerged first. He claimed to be a victim of Ashley's manipulation, a grieving husband who had been drawn into her plot through emotional coercion and lies. My client was led to believe this was an insurance fraud scheme, not a murder plot, his attorney argued in preliminary hearings. Miss Thompson convinced him that her sister would be safely evacuated by an accomplice on the ground after staging the fall. He never intended actual harm to come to his wife. Ashley's team countered with equal desperation. MS. Thompson was under the psychological control of Brent Taylor, who had been systematically isolating her from other relationships and exploiting her financial vulnerability. She participated under explicit threats to her safety. Watching them scramble to paint each other as the mastermind was both vindicating and exhausting. The pilot, facing his own charges as an accomplice, quickly accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony, confirming that both Ashley and Brent had been involved in planning the accident, and that he had been told I would only be frightened, not actually pushed. The trial itself was a grueling 3-week ordeal. I testified for 2 full days, recounting every excruciating detail from the helicopter push to my wilderness survival to the funeral confrontation. Looking directly at Ashley and Brent in the courtroom, their designer clothes exchanged for prison attire, their confident expressions replaced by desperate calculation, I felt an unexpected emotion. Pity. Not forgiveness, certainly not understanding, but a distant pity for the smallness of their ambitions and the emptiness of their characters. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The judge, citing the extraordinary calculation and cold-bloodedness of the crime, sentenced them to the maximum, 25 years for Ashley, 28 for Brent, due to the additional financial crimes that had come to light during the investigation. As they were led from the courtroom, Ashley finally breaking down in sobs, Brent still maintaining a stoic facade, I realized that the conclusion of the legal process didn't bring the closure I had expected. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but my personal healing had barely begun. The months following the trial were a blur of physical and emotional recovery. My body gradually healed. The broken femur required 2 additional surgeries and extensive physical therapy, but eventually I progressed from wheelchair to walker to cane to walking unassisted. The physical scars would remain, but they faded from angry red to silvery white, becoming part of my new normal. The psychological recovery proved more challenging. I worked with Dr. Eleanor Rivera, a trauma specialist who helped me navigate the complex landscape of betrayal by those closest to me. "What you're experiencing is compound trauma," she explained during one particularly difficult session. "There's the physical trauma of the fall and survival, yes, but also the attachment trauma of having your fundamental trust violated by your primary relationships. Your brain is essentially rewiring its understanding of safety. The nightmares were the worst, vivid recreations of the fall, sometimes with variations where I watched myself plummeting from above, sometimes where I hit the ground instead of the trees. I would wake, gasping, my body convinced it was still falling. Dr. Rivera taught me grounding techniques, ways to remind my nervous system that I was safe in the present moment. Place your feet firmly on the floor, she would instruct. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. Remind your body where and when it exists. Slowly, the acute panic began to subside, though certain triggers remained powerful. The sound of helicopter blades, unexpected drops in elevation, even the particular shade of blue that matched the Alaskan sky that day. While working on my psychological recovery, I also faced the challenge of reclaiming my professional identity. My company had been in leadership limbo during my death and subsequent reappearance. Marco, my loyal COO, had kept operations running, but strategic decisions had been postponed, and some nervous clients had taken their business elsewhere. The board called an emergency meeting upon my return, expressing concern about the company's stability given both the trauma I had experienced and the sensational nature of the case. "The publicity is problematic," one board member said delicately. "Investors are worried about associating with such a high-profile scandal." "Problematic," I repeated, feeling a flash of the new anger that seemed to live just beneath my surface these days. I was the victim of attempted murder. I survived against impossible odds. I helped bring the perpetrators to justice. Which part of that narrative concerns our investors, exactly? The room fell silent until Marco spoke up. "I think what Miranda is suggesting, and I agree, is that we can reframe this story as one of resilience, determination, and triumph. Those are values our company has always stood for." That reframing became our new direction. Rather than hiding from the publicity, we leaned into it, on my terms. I gave a single in-depth interview to a respected business journal, focusing not on the sensational aspects of the case, but on the psychological resources and problem-solving mentality that had helped me survive both the wilderness and the betrayal. The same skills that build successful companies, assessing resources, identifying critical paths, maintaining focus under pressure, adapting to changing conditions, saved my life in that forest, I explained. And they're the same skills that will guide our company forward. The interview resonated widely, changing the conversation from lurid fascination to professional respect. New clients approached us specifically because of the demonstrated resilience, and most existing clients recommitted to our services. 6 months after the trial, I made 2 significant decisions that would shape my future. First, I established the Wilderness Survival Foundation, using a portion of my own funds, ironically including the life insurance policy that had been returned to me once the murder plot was exposed. The foundation focused on 2 missions: providing wilderness survival training to the public and supporting survivors of intimate partner betrayal and violence. Second, I began the process of meeting with other betrayal survivors, people whose stories weren't as dramatic as mine, but who carried similar wounds. A former client whose business partner had embezzled funds and framed him for tax evasion. A woman whose sister had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit. A man whose wife of 30 years had systematically turned their children against him with years of subtle lies. These connections formed the beginning of a support network that would eventually become as important to me as my business achievements. In helping others navigate their rebuilding process, I found frameworks for my own healing. 1 year after the helicopter incident, I returned to Alaska, not to the exact location of my fall, but to the hospital that had treated my injuries. I brought a substantial donation for their trauma center and spent time with the emergency team that had saved my life. "I didn't expect you to ever want to see Alaska again," admitted Dr. Winters, who had overseen my emergency surgeries. "It's not Alaska's fault that human beings can be monsters," I replied. "This place is part of my story now, the place where I died in one sense and was reborn in another. I needed to reclaim it." As I stood looking out over the majestic wilderness from a safe, solid viewing platform rather than a helicopter, I felt a sense of perspective that had been missing in the chaotic aftermath of the trial. The landscape that had nearly killed me had also provided the means for my survival: the trees that broke my fall, the water that quenched my thirst, the shelter that protected me from the elements. Perhaps there was a metaphor there, I thought, about how the very experiences that break us can also become the source of our greatest strength. Exactly 1 year to the day after I crashed my own funeral, I found myself sitting alone in the cemetery, facing the now-removed memorial stone that had once borne my name. The grounds crew had replaced it with fresh sod months ago, but I could still see the outline where it had been, a ghost rectangle marking the spot where I was supposed to rest but never would. So much had changed in that year. My company had not only recovered but expanded, launching a new cybersecurity division that drew on my newfound appreciation for preparing for worst-case scenarios. The Wilderness Survival Foundation had trained over 2,000 people in basic outdoor emergency skills and provided therapy services to dozens of betrayal survivors. My physical recovery was as complete as it would ever be. I no longer needed a cane, though my left leg ached predictably before rainstorms, and certain movements would always remain difficult. The scars had faded to the point where makeup could conceal them for professional appearances, though I increasingly chose not to bother. They were part of my story now, badges of survival rather than marks of victimhood. After sitting at the empty gravesite for nearly an hour, I drove to the cemetery where my parents were actually buried. I hadn't visited since before the helicopter incident. In fact, Ashley and I had come together the previous Christmas, placing matching wreaths and sharing memories of holiday traditions from our childhood.
"Hey, Mom."
"Hey, Dad," I said quietly, placing fresh flowers between their headstones. "I'm not sure if you know what happened with Ashley. Part of me hopes you don't." The wind rustled through nearby trees, the only response to my words. "I keep thinking about what you would say if you were here. Would you ask me to forgive her? Would you be able to forgive her yourselves? She was your daughter too. You loved her just as much as you loved me." I traced my fingers over their names carved in stone. I think about nature versus nurture a lot these days. We had the same parents, the same upbringing. Where did that darkness in her come from? Was it always there? Did I miss it, or did something happen to create it? Is there some darkness in me too, just waiting for the right circumstances? These were questions I had explored extensively in therapy, but had found no satisfying answers. The uncomfortable truth was that human beings, even those sharing DNA, even those we believe we know completely, remain fundamentally mysterious to one another. When I returned home that evening, a letter was waiting for me, forwarded from my lawyer, having passed through the prison screening system. Ashley's handwriting on the envelope was instantly recognizable, the same neat, precise script that had addressed birthday cards and Christmas presents throughout our lives. For several hours, I left it unopened on my kitchen counter, going about my evening routine while eyeing it warily, as if it might somehow contain the same danger its author had once posed. Finally, just before midnight, I slid my finger under the flap and extracted 3 pages of prison stationery. "Miranda," it began, "no, dear. No terms of endearment. I've written this letter 17 times. Each version sounds more false than the last, probably because there is no way to authentically apologize for trying to murder your sister. Any explanation I offer will sound like an excuse. Any remorse I express will seem like manipulation. I accept that. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and requesting it would only be another selfish act. But I do want you to know that in the endless hours of confinement here, I've finally begun to understand what I did, not just to you, but to myself. I destroyed everything good in my life because I couldn't bear that you had everything I wanted. The jealousy started so small, little moments of resentment when you'd succeed at something that had been difficult for me. It grew so gradually, I didn't recognize the monster it was becoming. By the time Brent came into our lives, I was already so poisoned by it that his manipulation found fertile ground. This isn't an attempt to shift blame. I made my choices. I looked my own sister in the eyes and pushed her to what should have been her death. The person capable of that deserves to be exactly where I am now. What I'm trying to say, inadequately, is that I see myself clearly for the first time. Prison has stripped away every distraction, every justification. All that's left is the truth of what I did and who I became. You survived, against all odds. From what I've read in the articles my counselor shares with me, you're thriving. I'm glad. Not because it lessens my guilt. Nothing could do that, but because the world is better with you in it. That's something I lost sight of for too long. I won't write again unless you want me to. This letter isn't the beginning of a reconciliation campaign. It's just the truth, finally. Too late to matter. Ashley. I read the letter 3 times before setting it down, my emotions too tangled to name. Was there manipulation hidden in her words? Probably. Was there also genuine remorse? Possibly. Did it change anything? No. But something about having her acknowledgement, the unvarnished admission of what she had done, without the courtroom gymnastics of blame shifting, provided a piece of closure I hadn't realized I was missing. I didn't respond to the letter that night or the next day or the next week. I brought it to my next therapy session, where Dr. Rivera and I discussed what Ashley's words meant to my healing process and what, if anything, I wanted to do with them. You don't owe her a response, Dr. Rivera reminded me. Your healing doesn't depend on maintaining any connection with her. I know, I said. But I keep thinking about that moment in the helicopter, the last moment when she was still just my sister and not the person who tried to kill me. There was a split second before she pushed me when I saw something change in her eyes. I've replayed that moment so many times, wondering if I could have said or done something different. That's a common reaction for trauma survivors, Dr. Rivera said gently, looking for the moment where you could have changed the outcome. But Ashley's choices weren't your responsibility. Intellectually, I know that. But there's still this voice asking why I didn't see it coming, why I trusted so completely. Because trust is human. Vulnerability is human. Those aren't weaknesses, Miranda. They're the foundations of connection. That night, I made a decision about Ashley's letter. I would neither respond nor completely close the door. I would sit with the complexity of having a sister who is also my would-be murderer, a person I had once loved who had betrayed me in the most profound way possible. I would accept that both realities could exist simultaneously and that my healing didn't require resolving that paradox. As for Brent, I felt nothing but a distant contempt. His betrayal, while equally severe, lacked the primal violation of a sibling's attempt on my life. He had been my husband for 3 years. Ashley had been my sister for 32. The depth of history made her betrayal cut deeper, but also made its aftermath more complicated. In the weeks that followed the anniversary of my death, I found myself entering a new phase of recovery, one focused less on processing the trauma and more on defining the life I wanted to create moving forward. The question shifted from, why did this happen to me, to who am I becoming because of what happened? The survival skills that had kept me alive in the wilderness became metaphorical guides for my new life. Just as I had assessed my resources and injuries after the fall, I now took inventory of my strengths and vulnerabilities with clear eyes. Just as I had created shelter from available materials, I now built protective boundaries around my new relationships while remaining open to genuine connection. I began dating again, cautiously, selectively. James, a civil engineer I met through the Foundation's wilderness training program, became a steady presence in my life. He approached my story with neither morbid fascination nor excessive caution, treating my experience as part of me, but not my defining characteristic. What impressed me most wasn't that you survived the fall or even the wilderness, he told me after several months of dating. It was that you chose to use what happened to help others. You could have disappeared into a private life of justified paranoia, but instead you built something meaningful from the wreckage. His perspective helped me see my own journey more clearly. The wilderness survival had been physical and immediate. Splint the broken leg, find water, create shelter, signal for help. The emotional survival that followed was more complex and ongoing. Acknowledge the pain, process the betrayal, rebuild trust selectively, find meaning in the experience. 2 years after the helicopter incident, I gave my first public speech about the experience at a conference for trauma survivors. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of people who had endured their own versions of betrayal and loss, I finally found the words to articulate what I had learned. We often talk about surviving trauma as if it's a return to who we were before, I began. But that's not how it works. You don't go back to being the person you were. That person is gone, not because they were weak or flawed, but because trauma fundamentally changes how we understand ourselves and the world around us. The question isn't how to become that person again. The question is how to honor what they believed in while becoming someone new, someone who carries the truth of what happened without being defined by it. Someone who understands darkness more intimately but chooses light anyway, not out of naivety, but out of informed courage. I'm not the woman who boarded that helicopter in Alaska 2 years ago. That woman trusted completely, loved unconditionally, believed in the fundamental goodness of those closest to her. I honor her optimism and her openness. I grieve for her loss. But I'm not only the woman who fell from the sky and crawled through wilderness with a broken body either. That woman survived on rage and determination, on the driving need to see justice done. I respect her resilience and her strength. I acknowledge her pain. I'm what comes after both of them, a third version that incorporates the trust of the first and the resilience of the second, but exists in a new space of chosen vulnerability and informed hope. This version doesn't trust blindly, but chooses to trust carefully. She doesn't love without boundaries, but loves with healthy ones. She isn't naive about human capacity for betrayal, but she refuses to let that knowledge close her off from human connection. That's what survival really means, not just continuing to exist, but continuing to evolve. Not just enduring the fall, but learning to fly differently afterward. As I concluded my speech to resounding applause, I felt a sense of completion, not of my healing journey, which would continue throughout my life, but of the acute phase of recovery. The story of the helicopter, the betrayal, and the wilderness would always be part of me, but it no longer needed to be the primary story I told about myself or the lens through which I viewed every experience. There would be other chapters, other challenges, other triumphs. The woman who had crashed her own funeral was ready to attend the celebration of her new life, not as a ghost or a victim, but as the author of her continuing story. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you deeply trusted? How did you rebuild afterward? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if my journey of survival and transformation resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that there's life after betrayal. Thank you for joining me on this incredibly personal story. Remember, even the deepest wounds can become the source of your greatest strength.